Hello and welcome. My name is Patrick Machayo, and thank you very much for joining me once again in this ongoing conversation about democracy, governance, leadership, institutional legitimacy, and the growing crisis of trust in America. This is episode 3 of our 5-part series titled The Crisis of Trust in America: Leadership, Democracy, Dishonesty, and the Strain on American Institutions. In episode 1, we explored how Americans gradually began losing faith in institutions through repeated experiences involving war fatigue, political scandals, financial crises, institutional contradictions, and growing public frustration. In episode 2, we discussed media fragmentation, social media outrage, misinformation, emotional tribalism, and the collapse of shared reality in modern America. We explored what happens when citizens increasingly consume entirely different informational and emotional worlds. Today we are going to discuss something that may be even more emotionally complicated: science, COVID, vaccines, public health, and the growing collapse of trust in expertise itself. Because one of the most dangerous things that can happen in a modern society is when citizens no longer know which experts they can trust. And honestly, I think America is struggling deeply with that problem today. This episode is especially personal for me because I have spent much of my life believing strongly in institutions, expertise, and professional authority. I grew up during a period when Americans generally trusted doctors, scientists, military leaders, public health officials, and government institutions far more than many people do today. When I was younger, expertise carried weight. People might disagree politically, but there was still broad respect for professional knowledge and institutional competence. Doctors were trusted, scientists were trusted, teachers were trusted, public health authorities were trusted. And honestly, I think many Americans assumed these systems broadly existed to protect society. But over time, especially during the COVID era, I began watching that trust fracture dramatically. And what disturbed me most was not simply the political conflict itself. It was the emotional confusion underneath it. People genuinely no longer knew whom to believe. I want to approach this topic carefully because emotions surrounding COVID, vaccines, and public health remain extremely intense for many Americans. This is not going to be a simplistic conversation. It is not going to be a partisan rant. And it is not going to be an anti-science discussion either. In fact, one of the things that worries me most is how rapidly distrust toward expertise itself has spread across American society. Because modern civilization depends heavily on expertise. We trust doctors to understand medicine, engineers to design bridges safely, scientists to study disease, pilots to fly aircraft, public health officials to respond during emergencies. Without broad trust in expertise, modern societies become unstable very quickly. And honestly, I think COVID exposed just how fragile American trust had already become before the pandemic even started. The virus itself was frightening enough. People were dying, hospitals were overwhelmed, communities were frightened, families were isolated, and many Americans desperately wanted reassurance and clarity. But instead of producing national unity, COVID often intensified division, and social media amplified every contradiction instantly. At different moments during the pandemic, political leaders contradicted scientists. Scientists contradicted one another publicly. Public health recommendations evolved rapidly. Media organizations sometimes sensationalized fear. Conspiracy theories exploded online. Political identity became deeply intertwined with public health behavior. Eventually, millions of Americans stopped knowing whom they could trust anymore. That emotional confusion mattered enormously. I remember watching debates over masks become intensely political, something that many people initially viewed primarily as a public health issue increasingly became an ideological identity marker. Wearing masks became political. Refusing masks became political. Vaccines became political. Public health agencies became political. Even basic scientific discussions became emotionally tribalized. That deeply unsettled me, because once expertise itself becomes viewed primarily through partisan identity, trust collapses rapidly. And unfortunately, many Americans already carried deep institutional suspicion before COVID even began. The Iraq War damaged trust. Financial scandals damaged trust. Political corruption damaged trust. Media fragmentation damaged trust. So when COVID arrived, many Americans were already psychologically primed to distrust institutions. Then came social media. And honestly, social media may have been one of the single most destabilizing forces during the pandemic. False information spread instantly. Fear spread instantly. Rumors spread instantly. Emotion spread instantly. One video could reach millions of people within hours, regardless of accuracy. And because many people were already emotionally frightened, they became highly vulnerable to information reinforcing existing fears or suspicions. Some Americans believed the government exaggerated the threat. Others believed political leaders minimized the danger irresponsibly. Some believed pharmaceutical companies could not be trusted. Others believed anti-vaccine movements were placing society at risk. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens sat in the middle of all this confusion, trying to determine what was actually true. That is psychologically exhausting. One thing I increasingly realized during COVID is that expertise itself now competes directly against algorithm-driven emotional ecosystems. And unfortunately, algorithms reward emotional intensity more than careful complexity. Fear spreads quickly, outrage spreads quickly, conspiracy spreads quickly. Nuance does not. Calm scientific explanation rarely goes viral. Emotionally provocative claims often do. And modern Americans consume information at extraordinary speed. There is very little time for reflection anymore. Everything moves instantly. One of the things that especially disturbed me during COVID was how quickly public health conversations sometimes became moral warfare rather than collective problem solving. People increasingly viewed one another through suspicion and hostility. And once societies lose the ability to discuss public health crises calmly and rationally, democratic strain intensifies. I also think many Americans struggled emotionally with the fact that scientific understanding evolves over time. Science is not magic certainty. Scientific understanding changes as new evidence emerges. Recommendations evolve. Knowledge develops. But unfortunately, many citizens interpreted changing recommendations as evidence of dishonesty rather than evidence of scientific adjustment during unprecedented crisis. That further weakened trust. And then politics intensified everything. Donald Trump became one of the most polarizing figures in modern American political history, and COVID unfolded directly inside that polarization. Some Americans trusted him deeply. Others distrusted him intensely. I remember hearing discussions surrounding COVID treatments that often sounded surreal and emotionally chaotic. At times, political rhetoric appeared to conflict openly with scientific institutions and public health messaging. And many Americans increasingly began asking, if leaders contradict experts publicly, whom are we supposed to trust? That question matters enormously. Because democratic societies require citizens to possess some level of confidence in institutional competence during emergencies. Without that confidence, chaos grows rapidly, and unfortunately, COVID exposed just how emotionally fragmented America had already become. Research from organizations including Pew Research Center and Gallup later showed declining trust, not only in government and media, but increasingly in scientific and medical institutions themselves. That should concern every American regardless of ideology. Because once large portions of society stop trusting expertise broadly, future crises become even harder to manage. We are already seeing some consequences today. Diseases once largely controlled through vaccination have begun resurfacing in some areas. Public health debates increasingly become politically toxic. Scientific institutions themselves face growing suspicion. And honestly, I think many Americans now approach expertise through political identity first, rather than professional credibility. That is dangerous. Now let me be clear about something important. Questioning institutions is not automatically irrational. Democracy requires skepticism. Citizens should ask questions. They should demand transparency. They should challenge authority when necessary. But there is a difference between healthy skepticism and total institutional collapse. Healthy skepticism says, explain the evidence. Total cynicism says, all expertise is manipulation. Those are very different psychological conditions. And unfortunately, America increasingly appears to be drifting toward generalized distrust across multiple sectors simultaneously. That worries me deeply because no advanced society can function indefinitely once citizens broadly distrust doctors, scientists, journalists, elections, courts, educators, public institutions. Eventually, social cohesion itself weakens. I became increasingly interested in these themes while writing The Weight of the Biden Presidency: Power, Repair, and the Strain of Governance. One of the central questions I kept returning to was this: how does democratic leadership function in a society where trust itself is collapsing? Because governance becomes extraordinarily difficult once citizens no longer believe institutions operate legitimately. Even effective policies increasingly fail to generate confidence because distrust itself becomes the dominant emotional lens. That emotional lens shapes everything. I also think many Americans underestimate the psychological toll of permanent crisis culture. Over the last 2 decades, Americans have experienced terrorism, endless wars, financial collapse, political polarization, mass shootings, pandemic fear, economic instability, social media overload, non-stop outrage cycles. Human beings were not psychologically designed to absorb this level of continuous emotional strain indefinitely. Eventually, exhaustion sets in, and exhausted citizens often seek emotional certainty wherever they can find it. That is one reason conspiracy theories become attractive psychologically. Conspiracy theories simplify complexity, they reduce uncertainty, they provide emotional explanation, during frightening periods, and social media spreads them rapidly. Unfortunately, many conspiracy-driven communities also create strong emotional belonging for isolated individuals. That makes them even harder to challenge. Because people are not merely defending information, they are defending identity and community. That is one reason modern democratic fragmentation feels so emotionally intense. People increasingly experience information through emotional belonging rather than careful analysis. And honestly, I think loneliness plays a role here too. As we discussed in my earlier loneliness series, emotionally isolated citizens often become more vulnerable to manipulation, outrage ecosystems, conspiratorial thinking, and civic distrust. Disconnected people frequently search for meaning and certainty, and online communities often provide both, even when the information itself becomes dangerous or misleading. This is one reason I increasingly believe America's democratic crisis is not simply political. It is emotional, it is psychological, it is social, and it is institutional simultaneously. That broader theme became central to my later work in America, at 250, Democracy at Risk and America Under Strain, the unfinished work of American democracy. Because modern democratic instability increasingly reflects emotional fragmentation inside society itself. People feel overwhelmed, exhausted, distrustful, disconnected, and under those conditions, rebuilding civic trust becomes extraordinarily difficult. Still, despite all these concerns, I remain hopeful, and I want to emphasize that clearly. America still possesses extraordinary strengths: scientific innovation, democratic resilience, institutional capacity, remarkable healthcare professionals, brilliant researchers, engaged citizens, dedicated public servants. The problem is not that America lacks capable people. The problem is that public trust itself has weakened profoundly, and rebuilding trust requires much more than political slogans. Trust requires transparency, consistency, honesty, humility, accountability, competence. Most importantly, trust requires institutions willing to admit mistakes openly rather than appearing defensive or manipulative. Because once citizens begin feeling emotionally manipulated repeatedly, distrust deepens rapidly. And unfortunately, many Americans increasingly feel manipulated constantly by politics, by media, by algorithms, by outrage culture, and sometimes even by institutions themselves. That emotional fatigue matters enormously. One of the deepest lessons I have learned over time is that democracy depends not only on laws and constitutions, it also depends on emotional legitimacy. Citizens must broadly believe institutions are trying, truth matters, experts are acting in good faith, and society still shares some common purpose. Without those things, democratic culture weakens gradually over time. And honestly, I think many Americans today are searching desperately for something simple: people and institutions they can trust again. Not perfection, not ideological purity. Trust, competence, stability, honesty, and leaders willing to calm emotional chaos rather than intensify it constantly. Because outrage may dominate the internet, but trust is what holds societies together. In episode 4 of this series, we are going to discuss corruption, elite accountability, executive power, ethical scandals, and why many ordinary Americans increasingly believe the rules apply differently to powerful people. We are going to examine why perceptions of unfairness damage democratic legitimacy so deeply, and why many citizens increasingly feel disconnected from political leadership itself. My name is Patrick Machayo, and I want to thank you very much for joining me in this ongoing conversation about democracy, governance, leadership, public trust, institutional legitimacy, and the growing crisis of trust in America.